Welcome everybody to my YouTube channel, Truth Emotion Studios. Today I'm speaking with Ryan Braley for the second time. He is a pastor in my town and we want to zone in on talking about his YWAM experience today. So just a disclaimer or explanation, I am not on some kind of a personal vendetta after YWAM. My job here at my channel is to speak about spiritual abuse. And if anything, that I'd like you to take away from today's meeting is that no place is safe. Like we could say, don't go to YWAM or do go to YWAM, or here's that one location where you'll be for sure safe. That place just doesn't exist. And so what we'll be talking about today is trying to hold that knowledge and then our experiences kind of loosely, looking at the bad, looking at the good, and trying to come up with some wisdom for you guys. So, Ryan, you were in Denver, YWAM Denver.
Yes.
What was going on back then? When did you go into it? What were you expecting? What were you like? Tell me like the setting of it all.
Yeah. So I went to YWAM when I was 18, and I found I was there for a total of 8 years, and I found that one of the types of people that end up at YWAM, like me, are folks who come out of high school with no real direction or plans, like concrete ones, and that either love God a lot or love God a little, or like just but aren't sure what to do next. So they kind of go to YWAM to help sort it out. And that was me. So I I left high school and had gotten into some bad habits in high school. And so I didn't have a lot of options in terms of college, mostly because I thought if I graduate and go to college, then I would have kept making those bad decisions and being in those bad habits, and it would have been a disaster for me. And I was smart enough to at least know that I shouldn't go to college where there was like no adult supervision, and I would have made a lot of bad decisions. So I went there because my sister had gone there back in '96, and she loved it. And I remember talking with her because in '96 I was in a bit of a rebellious stage. And I remember telling her, like, you're gonna be a missionary, like in India somewhere. You're gonna be poor and broke, and like what a waste of a life, which was just ignorant. But then I went to go visit her that next year. And when I went there to the YWAM Denver base, I thought there was only one YWAM. I didn't know there was like many locations all over the world. So it was like a half an hour from our house, or 45 minutes from our house. And I went to go visit them, and all I remember was that everybody was super nice to me. And I'm like, man, everyone's so nice. And I was in high school where people are not so nice, you know. And there was something about it. Went to worship, and I had a really, really neat experience in middle school in a church where I just sort of fell in love with God. And a lot of what I do in my life, I'm like all in or all out. And so when I fell in love with God in middle school, I was like all in. I was like bringing my Bible to school, and I had the Christian t-shirts, and it was probably super annoying, but I genuinely loved Jesus. And so I was in, you know. And then I had walked away from a lot of that for various reasons. But when I went back to YWAM to visit my sister, it was really a neat experience just because they were so nice. I felt something, you know, sort of transcendent in those worship times, or that worship time. And I left thinking that wasn't all bad, you know. So anyway, when I graduated high school, I didn't know what to do next. And my sister was like asking, she's like, you should go do YWAM. And I had a friend who had rheumatoid arthritis in high school, missed a bunch of school. His grades were not great. And we were both kind of in that liminal space of what to do now. And I said to him one night, I go, if you go to YWAM, I'll go to YWAM. And he goes, all right. And so we went, and I went not knowing what to expect and what to think. I guess I was expecting, well, I'll tell you this. I said, if God is real, because I'd had that experience in middle school, right? And like, if that was real, if God is real, then I genuinely, I owe it another month or so to explore it, to see if it's really real. And if it is, then I don't know, as a 19-year-old, 18-year-old, I'm like, if it is real, then I owe it my life, or my attention, my dedication, something I gotta take, you know. If not, then I'll go become a doctor and try to be rich or whatever, you know. Like, I didn't know what else my aim would be in life if I, you know, other than make money, or, you know. So I'm like, I'm going to go and try to explore and see if this was really real, if that experience I had in middle school is really real. And so I went with that in mind, trying to explore, what is God? What is faith? What is the Bible? What does it mean for me? And if nothing, then cool, I can be done with it and move on. But if there's something there, then I owe it, at least a little bit of my attention. And so I went, and I'll never forget YWAM has a lot of idiosyncrasies. They're hilarious, and some are just goofy. But we do. There's like I remember that first week I was in a dinner cleanup crew, and again, all kinds of folks come to YWAM, right? All kinds. And I was there, not super serious about God or anything like that, just kind of scoping it out. And this one night we're cleaning up, and this one girl yells out, "Praise the Lord," and she made us all yell, "Praise the Lord." And I was like, I'm not yelling that, it was kind of weird. But then as the week progressed, I just began to get a feeling of like home. Home is like an analogy I use a lot for, like, I don't know, just being in tune with the Father, or being at home. I love the story of the prodigal son, so I have that in the back of my mind. But I don't know, I just felt like I was at home. I don't mean YWAM Denver specifically, but I just felt like I'd come home. You know what I mean? So there I was.
Yeah. And so first, great experiences, or were there right away some things where you were set straight?
Yeah, good question. No, for me, and I think we mentioned this a little bit in our last time together, but for me, YWAM Denver is known for, or it was at the time, known for being a little more strict in terms of things you couldn't do. And so, but honestly, for me, I needed it. Like, I needed to have boundaries. I've learned over the course of my life that, Ryan with boundaries is good. I think it was Picasso who said that you should learn the rules like a professional, so that you can break them like an artist. And that's kind of how I am. I think we need to learn those rules, boundaries, borders, and conventional wisdom in order to know how to behave properly. And then as you grow and mature and move beyond some of those boxes, those frameworks, you can begin to learn, okay, here's where I can push, here's where I can step out of bounds, those kinds of things. And so for me, I was still in that young, knuckleheaded, part of my life. And a lot of young men, I think, they say like that part of your brain that can foresee consequences isn't really developed yet when you're that age. And so for example, they didn't allow dating at all, or rather they didn't allow you to start a new relationship with another person during your school. And some people were like, this is crazy. It's too stringent. It's oppressive. But I was like, this is great, because I had been, I dated a lot in high school, and none of them were healthy. Most of them were unhealthy. And so I needed some time away from that part of me to just spend, devoted to God. It's sort of like no different than what the Catholic Church does with their, their priests and their nuns and stuff. But to devote that time, or there was a bedtime, 10 p.m. to be in bed, and that was good for me, because otherwise I'd have been up till 2 a.m. doing dumb stuff, And so it was really good for me because it provided structure and boundaries and borders. And there were 2 men there who really, took a notice of me and began to sort of mentor me and pour into my life. And what they did that was helpful for me, that I've tried to do as an older man now, is I think they saw things in me and they called that out of me, or they spoke it out loud to me. And so, I'm 19, I'm a goofball, and they would say things like, Ryan, I think that God has gifted you like this. You should think about this. And I was like, wow. And no man had ever done that for me. Well, I shouldn't say no man. Again, I grew up without a father. And so I didn't have a lot of men who would say to me like, Ryan, this is how I see you as a young man and how God has gifted you. I'm going to pray for you that, whatever. I just didn't have a lot of affirming men. I did have some, thankfully I did. But, so that was helpful too, and those guys weren't perfect. They had their own foibles, and they were both leaders pretty high up in the organizational structure of the thing. But that was really good for me, especially early on in my YWAM days.
Wow. Yeah. So it sounds like what other people would experience as oppressive and as like a prison. What, 10 p.m.
Right. Yeah.
Really, what was necessary for you. And that's so interesting how we all come from all these different places and respond differently to the same thing. Very interesting.
Yeah.
What would you say though was an experience that left you wondering for a moment? Because you have this feeling of home, but every once in a while you get like a gut punch and you don't know what's happening. Do you have an experience like that?
Yeah. I think one of the things that I struggled with early on was, and again, I think you kind of alluded to this in your introduction, but I've just found that life is so nuanced and complex, and I try to steer away from all of these really dogmatic stances on things. Now, certainly there are a lot of non-negotiables. Like you and I would probably agree we shouldn't murder people. Great. That's we can all agree. If you're not in agreement with that, you would probably be in prison or whatever. But a lot of things in life are just, I don't know, it's complex. And so I remember, again, some of these things in YWAM I think can be beneficial. They can also be used as a tool to manipulate or to distort. But again, as you and I have talked privately, I think a lot of that's just the human capacity to take a thing that's not good or bad in of itself and use it for sometimes for good, sometimes for not good. That's just kind of what we do as humans. I see it all the time, and I do it, But anyway, I one of the main emphases of YWAM is hearing the voice of God. And so when I came out of my time in high school, it was like pray and ask God, seek God, hear God's voice, ask God what you should do in this moment, in that moment, and for me as a young man, again, my mom was a wonderful mom and really was like the matriarch of our family. And so she was great as an authority figure in my life and really influential in my growth and even my spiritual life. She dragged us to church every week. Literally, I'd be hungover at church sometimes and she would have made me go, that kind of thing. She didn't know I was hungover, but so when I left that, I was like, I didn't really, I was now a young adult. And I'm like, okay, who is my authority? Who will help me? Because I needed it, and so that was good to like, okay, let's ask God. And I remember going to God with things and asking God. Now, here's where that can get a little bit funky. Two ways. One is, I believe that God does speak to us. It's in Scripture a ton. Even in some of these stories, these extremely brilliant theophanies where like God sort of shows up in some kind of a tangible way, like a burning bush, a pillar of fire, a talking donkey, all these bizarre things that seemingly don't happen as much. I don't have those a lot in my life. But I do believe that God speaks to us, right? And for me, I generally have a physical sensation like in this part of my body, like in my chest, stomach area. Then I have a thought that just keeps recurring. That's kind of how God seems to speak to me. But I don't know how you can get around it being at least a little bit subjective, that you're experiencing what you would call God speaking to you. And I emphatically believe he does. But ultimately, I don't know, I don't know. It's hard to say this is God. And I get nervous when I hear God told me this. And you're like, okay, I know it happens. But so for example, at YWAM then, what you would have is you would have a lot of people trying to figure out, is God speaking to me and how is he speaking? And then, as you can imagine, if you get a number of young people in that room and they're all seeking God's voice, there can be some people that say things like, that's not God. So I had my brother-in-law, he had like 3 women tell him that God told them to marry him, that they were going to marry him. And so either, and I don't think that they meant it. I don't know what they were thinking, but so either God's a polygamist or you didn't hear God properly, right? And so that's part of what I think community is really helpful for. Like, no, if that wasn't God. There's a church in the area. Well, I'll skip that story, but I've had pastors tell me when I've pushed back on things that they're doing, oh, well, Jesus told me to. Oh, okay, well, then you win. I can't argue against that. Like I had a friend who was doing something and I'm like, man, you should really be cautious about doing that. He said, well, Jesus told me to. Okay, then you win. It's a trump card, So anyway, that's the first thing, that it's subjective. The second thing is that sometimes then you don't do anything until you feel like God tells you to. And that's part of life, though, and growing. So me and my wife, Katie, we got married and joined staff there. And towards the end of our time, there was such an emphasis put on hearing God's voice. And we would make these year-long commitments to YWAM Denver. And at the time, it was great. I needed, it was good for me to be still and stay and have that long-term commitment. But as we got older, she and I began to get this itch to kind of leave. Nothing bad. We just were like, we feel like it's time to go. But we never felt like God spoke to us and told us to do it, So we were like, wow, well, we kind of want to go, but God never told us to. And would we be out of the will of God if we go? And what should we do? And I'll never forget, I had dinner with Greg Boyd. He's a pastor here in Maplewood. And he came to teach there a couple of years while I was there, and thankfully I met. He's wonderful, wonderful man. Read Anything You Can by Greg Boyd, and if you're ever going to meet him, I mean, he's one of those guys who talks about the love of God, and then you meet him, you're like, oh, this guy really loves God, and he seems like very Jesus-like, just really a loving guy. Anyway, and also he's smart, really smart guy. So we're hanging out talking. We were at I think at Macaroni Grill in Denver, and it was Katie, my wife, Greg, and I. And he goes, we're talking, and I said, I kind of think I want to leave YWAM and go to school, go back to college, because I was getting this itch again. And Greg was a catalyst for that, because I began to read his books. And if you read his books, man, this guy's great. And it began to stir in me this desire to kind of get more into like academia a little bit. And sometimes YWAM can be anti-intellectual or anti-academic for many reasons. And that was kind of my experience. I had a lot of leaders in YWAM who were like, oh, you don't need college. And I'm like, well, I kind of think it's a good thing too. And so I get it. But anyway, so I said, I don't know if we should go though, because because God hasn't told us to go. And Greg starts laughing. He goes, ha, ha, ha. Oh, is that how you think life works? And I was like, I did, right up until you laughed at me like that. And I go, what do you think? And he goes, well, I think, like Augustine said, love God and love others and do whatever you want. And the minute he said that, I was like, oh, I felt this like pressure release off my shoulders. I'm like, oh my gosh, I can go, I can leave. And so me and Katie, we left, I don't know, a year or so later, and we left because we wanted to, and we felt like it was a good decision. And we felt like as we were going, God was affirming it. I never got like a definitive voice from God to go. I never did, but I was okay with that. And I'm like, God, if I'm wrong, and if this isn't a good move, then show me. And I just had to, it was a trust. I had to trust that God would, sort of stop me or tell me. I mean, like, as a loving mother, wouldn't you, if your kid was doing something, you would be like, hey, don't do that. You would just tell them. So I was like trusting that God would help me as I was moving forward. And that's where we left. But I think that can be one of the things where I was like trying to discern, what does it mean to hear God's voice? How do we live in communion with God and hearing the voice of God when a lot of that can be subjective or feel subjective? And how do you have checks and balances for those kinds of, I heard God say, kinds of things? I don't ever want to like squelch the spirit, but also, we're humans and we get it wrong sometimes. So that was a tension I experienced in YWAM for sure.
Hmm. Okay, that was a lot of topical things I wanted to go back to.
Yeah, sorry. Cut me off anytime too. Just cut me off. I
just something about I like to let people finish their thought. There's something about that.
Yeah. No, interrupt if you need to. I don't mind.
Yeah, when I watch TV and this constantly people interrupting is very frustrating to me.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
I aim to let people finish and try to remember what I wanted to go back to. So what I would like to go back to is, are you saying that the strong emphasis on you have to hear the voice of God made you yourself a little bit, well, I've seen people go quite cuckoo because the Lord didn't tell them they could eat that day. And so you said a burden lifted.
Yeah.
So it sounds like it went a little bit in that direction. So that's kind of theology, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think it did for me. But I wonder if that wasn't just a part of my own maturation process. Like, I think early on, I needed to know that God speaks. Okay, then I'll wait for God to speak. Mm-hmm. And then it's like, as you begin to listen, then it's like, hey, but also you're a human being, so go be a human being, Oh, okay, And that was Greg sort of saying to me, okay, so for example, too, like you would go on these outreaches when you were all done with the school, and you'd go for 3 months somewhere, and you have like several options. And I was like, where do I want to go? Like I remember vividly in my school, we had Mexico. I think it was like Honduras, and then South Africa. And I want like the carnal side, the Ryan wanted to go. I'm like, I want to go to South Africa because that would be awesome, But I was like trying to be careful to not just do what I wanted to do, which was good for me because a lot of my later years in high school, I just did whatever I wanted to, which, isn't good. And so I was trying to put myself under, I do think that God, there's something about the authority, coming under the authority of God. Like he's the king of the world. He's a good king though, right? We've talked before about what does a good king look like versus a bad king. And so like, I think a lot of folks today, I really do have a struggle with authority. And then when we use that authoritarian language for God, and I get it, but I think a lot of it's because they're reacting to dysfunctional, broken, oppressive, views or authority figures, and that's fair. But if God is a good king, the kind of king that rules with love and mercy and actually invites us to co-rule, like, God, what king does that? That's good. And so for me, I needed to learn how to be under a good authority. And my mom had done a great job, and but I had rebelled, so I don't know, I think there's that. So part of it for me was early on learning how to listen for the voice of God, and then what does God want me to do? But then, of course, as you mentioned, the next logical step is, okay, then God, what should I have for breakfast? What should I wear with my clothes? And then there's also, so back to the outreaches, the Ryan and me wanted to go to South Africa because it'd be exotic and fun and it's far away. And I was praying, I'm like, God, is this just me? Because for many, many years recently, I've been doing whatever I wanted to do. And I'm like, is this just me? And then I really felt like I began to get counsel from some friends. Like, God was like, what if you just picked one, Ryan? And I was like, I can't do that. I have to hear God's voice, And so oddly enough, what happened was you had to raise a certain amount of money to go on this trip. And raising my money, I was like $800 short. This is a bizarre story. So I was about $800 short when I was raising money for my trip to South Africa. And if I didn't get the $800, I'd end up going to Mexico, which would have been fine. But I was like really disappointed. And the night it was due, I was short $800. And I got so frustrated, I got into an argument with my roommate. And my roommate was like, we were yelling back and forth, and I had a bit of a temper problem. And then our leaders came in, they sat us both down, and they're like, hey, you guys need to talk this out. And I just told them, I go, look, I'm in a bit of a crabby mood because I wanted to go here and I'm short. And I didn't tell him how much I was short. And he sits up and he goes, gosh, I feel like God was telling me to give you my money. And I go, what money? He's like, well, I was going to go to this one trip. He was going to Honduras, ended up going to Mexico, didn't need this chunk of money he had. He goes, I'm going to give it to you. You can have it for your trip. I was like, wow, that's amazing. I go, how much is it? He goes, $800. I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. And so it was this, I don't know. It was weird because I wanted to go to South Africa. I feel like God was like, pick whatever you want, Ryan. And then God seemingly provided this money for me to go. And so, but in that moment I learned, and I think looking back too, I think more often than not, God is like, where do you want to go? What do you want to do with your life? So Frederick Buechner says that your calling is where your heart's desire meets the world's greatest need. And I love that. And I would add, and you feel a sense of God calling you. And I know that word call has some issues, but I don't know, like a sense of draw to it, spirituals, if you will. And so because you and I are here for a reason, maybe not one specific reason, maybe we could be here for a million reasons, but I do think the one thing is, like, how can you bless the world? Like, Christina, what are you doing to bless the world? And I look at Abraham and Sarah, and that story to me is like, God blesses Abraham and Sarah so that they can be a blessing to everybody around them, everybody, the pagans, even. And so our job is to be a blessing to the world. So I always tell my church, which in the American church, I think is quite prophetic, whatever you have, whatever you've been given, it's for you to bless other people. So have open hands, let come, let go, be givers, and share and love and whatever. And so that's what we're here. So then Buechner, going back to Buechner, that's what you're here for. So then where are the needs in the world? And where does who you are and your heart's desire, the things you long for to be true, the things that you're passionate about, and I use that word loosely too, but where do those two coalesce? And then do that. And if you can get paid to do it, praise God, so do that. And that could be any number of things. So, and I think that, again, if you're waiting for the one big sexy thing that God tells you to do, you can be hamstrung. And so, but for me, I had to learn that, and it might have needed to be a process, a gradual journey. And then to hear Greg laugh at me, like, oh, you think that's how it goes? But it was also cool because, like, oh, my YWAM leaders, maybe they aren't, maybe it was good for me to have a couple different voices in my life, speaking into my life and giving me wisdom and discernment and thoughts and that kind of thing. Because what he said was different than what I've been kind of given before. And so that was good for me too, I think, to hear those different voices. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds all very beautiful. And it sounds really like you have developed the ability to look at everything negative and really look for the gems rather than focusing on the negatives. But
yeah,
that can also sound a little Pollyanna. And
sure.
part of, what I'm passionate about is that I want to help alleviate the pain that people feel of just the lack of feeling loved by God, or the confusion of what is going on here. There's so much stuff that comes in between just a flowing, healthy relationship that is life-giving and in the grain of life. That's kind of where my passion is. And I don't get paid for this at all, but I do it anyway. And it's almost better that I don't get paid. Because I'm not in it for the money. So, but.
Well, you told me before, you want to give space and maybe a voice to those who have endured pain and suffering at the hands of others. And that's wonderful. It's beautiful. I mean, I think there isn't, so we've been talking in our church here recently about how to use power, and like what you're doing is giving a platform to those, and you're just creating space. I feel like you're holding space even for those who have endured painful things, which I think is quite beautiful for sure.
What do I say? Praise the Lord. But I also feel, when you say the word, the Lord speaks, usually from the people that tell you that teach you that, it's not just, so what does the Lord say to you? It's also, here's what the Lord tells me for you. And that's a lot where the abuse comes in. And that's where a lot of people have their stories right in that teaching and their trauma in that. Is there anything that you have seen in that regard or experienced? I haven't really heard a real red flag from you yet, official, this was really abusive.
Well, that stuff goes on for sure, no doubt. And it's, again, I think that is, and the reason it's hard is because you have young, impressionable people, or folks who are, I guess, under, for lack of a better term, under the authority of a leader or a guide or a mentor. And so they're impressionable, and they hear that stuff, and it comes as law or as thus saith the Lord. And the problem is, a lot of leaders can be immature, and aren't hearing from God, or are using it for their own nefarious reasons. And I can't think of a specific example, but no doubt. And now for me, so, okay, I'm an Enneagram 7 and I have an 8 wing. And so the 8 in me is a challenger. And so, there's a part of it that I didn't last super long in YWAM because I was younger. And so now I've learned better how to challenge, but because there were moments where I would challenge thinking and things, and it's hard to do in a system and to challenge the system. And even when I got here, I'll tell you this, when I got here to Central, I'm in this Lutheran bubble, and I was exploring. I didn't grow up Lutheran, so I'm exploring what does it mean to be Lutheran, and I would ask questions about it. And some people, some Lutheran pastors I was talking to took that as me indicting Lutheranism or Lutheran theology, and I wasn't at all. That's how I learned. I push on those boundaries. I'm like, what about this? What about that? And two things happened that really helped me, and I think some of that is I was misunderstood because I'm a bit of a strong personality. The 8 is misunderstood as being a jerk, and perhaps I don't know
about that.
What's that?
I know a thing or two about that.
Right. Yeah. And so, but what's really neat is when you find somebody who can answer your questions, and they're not insecure about you being, even passionate about it. And I'll never forget the lead pastor here. His name was Paul Johansson. That's what he was. He was that for me. He was such a secure man that I would ask him all kinds of questions. And I don't know if he saw a bit of himself in me, but he was never threatened by my questions, and he never cared. And I was coming up underneath him, if you will. And actually, and now I'm in his old spot. But and you have to ask him, but he really trusted me, I think, and wasn't ever threatened by me, always promoted me, which some leaders don't do. We've talked about this. Some leaders feel threatened and they will cut you out from the knees. He didn't do that. The second thing that happened was there was a professor at Luther. His name was Dr. Stephen Paulson. And this guy's Lutheran, right? Like Lutheran. He's the guy. And so I would go ask him, I would pester him with questions after our class. And he was so cool. He'd be like, oh yeah. And he was just and we didn't agree on a number of things, because even within Lutheranism, as you can imagine, there are all kinds of threads and ways to think about things. But but he was not threatened. So I think the issue can be then, because what should happen then is the person who who hears the leader say, "The Lord told me this for you," that person should really take that and take it with a grain of salt, go and seek the Lord on their own, ask other counsel and wisdom, and then kind of figure out what, but not be afraid to question him. And the problem becomes when that leader is, I think it's rooted in insecurity. I'm generalizing here, but so forgive me, but I think it is, where they are like, no, you have, this is, you know, or dogmatism, and they don't want to be challenged or questioned, but that person should. I think we should always be questioning things around us and things of that nature, and not to be, and I never meant to be a jerk. I was genuinely, so then you and I as leaders, or as people with power, or the microphone, you as a teacher, me as a pastor, as a coach, whatever you're doing in life, I love allowing those, again, underneath you, or those you're developing or mentoring, let them question, man. Look at Jesus and the disciples. Those guys were maniacs. Peter draws his sword and Jesus is like, dude, chill out, you know? Yeah. And I mean, those guys, I mean, he had two of them betray, well, they all betrayed him, really. They all take off running at the very last moment. Judas sells him out. Peter denies him. I mean, it's like, it's wild. And Jesus is like, you know, but he's so good at like bringing them along. Jesus, of course, is never insecure, I don't think. And he lets those 12 especially, but a number of them, even the woman at the well, she's kind of like, you know, she has this escalating Christology where she has no idea who he is at first. And then she's pushing him and prodding and challenging, and he lets her. And then as she does, she's like, oh my gosh, this guy he's the man, you know? And so to me, a good leader, so yeah, red flag is for sure any leader that can't handle that kind of discourse or dialogue that's threatened by it. Now, I think it's our job then as like followers, as mentees, as people, as like, to also be gracious with those, to lead upwards, right? To somehow influence it. And then if you can't, that could be a problem, right? So you might have to kind of go somewhere else. But yeah, that's the red flag. And I always go back to this, and we were talking about this earlier, but is the power, when power is centralized. And when you said God told me so, that's a power move. It really is. And if God didn't say it, you know, and that can be very, very, very dangerous. So
the thing that I have experienced myself over and over again with my own group that was run by a man who had spent some time in YWAM in Germany, which is why I got interested to research YWAM in the first place. And I found so incredibly many similarities in the system of the abuse, and then the stories, and they would happen all over the world. But so this specific one is just really so prevalent. But the sad truth is, see here, you are telling me that you feel at home, you feel loved, you feel God. And now the leader tells you, like in my case, for instance, I've talked about this more recently, often. You don't go to your sister's wedding. You don't go.
Right.
Why not? Because the fact that I have to explain to you why you don't go there. This town is your missionary field. And then adding on, what if the Lord decides to throw a meteorite on that church, you know, those darn Baptists. Right. And so it's a point where I beg the Lord to speak to me, to give me clarity. I didn't even know anymore. I didn't want to make a mistake. I knew that. But the group wasn't about raising me up to know what I want. Nobody gave us that. It was like you were saying earlier, and it sounds so romantic, but in reality, you know, just learning to submit. I learned to submit. I submitted to the point of losing myself. But you just don't know that you're dealing with those kinds of people, I guess, unless, you know, there are people who sniff it out much quicker. I had a friend even who in college who I showed the website, and she was like, they're cult leaders. And I was like, what the heck? No way. So I had such a need coming to them that they sniffed me out like con men, and just I was stuck there. Just a little bit like you were saying, there was just no way out, and we were praying, because I got married in my group. We were praying for guidance. But what I wanted to get back to is this is what I tell people, and because this is a litmus test. What happens when you push back? So when you push back, and usually the pushback is you're out. It's like, you can't submit, you're out. Or go do your thing. Hopefully nothing bad happens. Or what about those people that are not going to be saved because you're off having your own
Sure.
fleshly good
Yeah.
time, and then you're trying to have a good time? It's impossible.
Yeah.
And so this
Yeah.
seems to
Yeah.
be a YWAM worldwide experience that people have. They're saying, I'd rather do this though, like family things, like
Yeah.
funerals, many
Sure.
family activities, and they're being told you can't go, and there is no
Yeah.
pushback room. So what do
Yeah.
you say to that? What, they will be kicked out
Yeah.
from home.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So my initial clarifying question back to you would be, you know, I always want to know precisely when people make these kinds of claims, who do you mean exactly? So when you said that usually the response is you're out, I would argue, I would maybe wonder if those are not universal experiences. It does happen, and you and I have talked about this. I know it happens, and you know, I've been able to read recently in the last couple of months about many folks' experiences in YWAM that were not good, and so no doubt that happens. Now, but I also know of a myriad of other experiences that weren't like that. So I would challenge you to be more specific in who. So no doubt that those exist, but to suggest that it's everybody, I think is, you know, maybe not the case. Now, we talked before too that I think one of the dangers is, and this is not just a YWAM, it's actually churches too that get planted with no accountability. But there, you know, YWAM, one of the models of it, or the model is built on this idea of giving away autonomy, which is not a bad thing, right? They're trying to let these YWAM locations function on their own. And so that does sound good. So, okay, there's not a hierarchy. There's not a bunch of, you know, there's no bishop that's overseeing you and getting in your business. However, same with churches. These churches just plant and get you know, popped up and great. So they're not hamstrung by a denomination that's going to lord over them and lead them dysfunctionally that way. But as you and I have talked, and even the church I grew up in that was planted like that and grew and got big, there's little accountability. And I know they have at YWAM, and it's probably gotten better, and I've been out for a long time, but there's not, like, we never had anybody that would come from like the region or the district and sit down with people and talk about issues that we were having or whatever. And so you've got these bases that pop up, and I know they have to go through a certain level of approval, but they're given full autonomy. And that, I don't know, you and I have talked, that can be dangerous when there's nobody there to tell that person no. And they do run it like they're the, I don't know, I almost said overlord, but you know, like they're the one, and the buck stops with them. And they might have a board, but you know, anybody can build a board with a bunch of sycophants or psychophants around them that just are yes people. And businesses do it too. We know that. I mean, like, good gosh. And so I think that you're right in that there are those experiences. I would be careful to just remember it isn't, no, it's more than maybe I even think, because you're right, I probably am more romantic, and I'm like, oh, only the good. So that's why it's good that you and I chat, because I think that both of us need to acknowledge, yeah, there is a lot of bad things, there's a lot of good things. And so but it goes back to me, and we've chatted before, but just this idea that whenever power is centralized and there's no one there to say no safeguard. You know, I think about the kings in the ancient world, and we were talking about Game of Thrones earlier, but when there's a king with absolute power, and, you know, in Israel's history, there were a lot of these kings that were, it says so-and-so was an evil king. You're like, oh gosh, it was like every other one was good, then evil, and good, and evil. Yeah. And they used that power to wield, but there were also good kings. And so it's interesting to note that as well. But when power is centralized, when there's no one there to say no to, and this structure has been built on the idea of giving away power, which we love, but when you give away power, then there's sometimes can be no accountability, and that can be a dangerous thing, because there are these small locations out in the middle of nowhere that are doing whatever they see fit, and they may not be a good leader. So going back to what you said, I don't think the problem is submitting to authority. The problem is when that authority is a bad authority figure, right? I mean, like when you and I have experiences, and I've had bosses, I've had YWAM leaders, I've had, you know, police officers too. This is the conversation around the police officers right now, I think too. Like, we are reacting as a public to some of these more egregious videotaped moments from these police. But you and I know also many, in my congregation, I know many wonderful police officers who are good people, men and women, and they're fighting for justice, and they're doing the thing. So and I don't want to be like just naive to the fact that there are police that abuse their position of power, but I also don't want to forget there are good men and women doing good police work. But again, that's that's sort of what happens, and so I think it's the power is what I get nervous about.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what I'm trying to get at is that we can say, okay, there's both the bad and the good.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we haven't really, or like I said, I haven't really heard you say, well, this was outright abusive. And I know that is true, but this is also true. And I learned from both. Not that I needed both, but I learned from both.
Yeah.
That's the tricky part, because in my mind, I am hearing the voices of the people that find themselves somewhere in some foreign country without money, in some shabby street, and they don't know the leader said they're going to take the taxi and they'll have to wait for the next one. And so all these crazy stories that people have experienced where their lives were even physically in danger or they felt unsafe. And then later there was just no reconciliation. There wasn't, their voices nobody cared for, their experiences weren't taken seriously. And again, this is not just going to happen in YWAM. This is going to happen where people are and where there's a hierarchy. So that if that's our lesson, then that'll be it. You will experience something good, you will experience something bad. The more, but maybe then this would be where we shift gears and talk about how do we prepare students then. I've had my niece decided to spend a year with another group, not YWAM, yet another group. And she experienced some not so good things, but certainly some great things. But what we did is we helped her be stirred in herself. So my impulse was to say, don't do it. Why would you go?
Right.
Even the person that she went with in their ministry, we know someone who had a huge legal issue with that person. Accused that person of losing all their money, all their property to that. So it's like serious stuff. We know that the who's leading that was not a kosher person. But she wanted to go, and so we said,
good for you.
God inside of you. And so she had a great time, but then she met people through there and went, and that's when she got herself into some bad trouble and called up her parents, and they picked her up, and that was when she was done. And it seems a little bit like, well, that kind of was a bad experience at that point. But again, life. And how do we learn from this stuff? So how would you say, how do we prepare people
great question.
want to go into missionary work and want to pick YWAM over navigators or whatever?
Well, and I will say this though, Christina, because you're right. I don't want to sound like all the things I went through were all positive. I didn't have real egregious things like the ones you're describing, even some of the ones I read. I honestly didn't at YWAM Denver. Not that they weren't going on or haven't since then. I mean, recently I was a part of Young Life, and when I was working with Young Life, had an older man who had an inappropriate relationship with a young girl. That stuff blows my mind, but that kind of thing didn't happen when I was at YWAM. But one thing, and I'll just, my own story, the ways which I think I misused power, and I think I shared this with you earlier, but that I regret is, we would have students come and they'd commit for 3 months, and some would leave after that and they'd be gone. And when they came, we were always trying to call them into a deeper walk with Jesus, whatever that means, right? But into deeper discipleship. And so I think I got a little bit maybe, I don't know, like high and mighty, and I need to call you to this higher standard. And then when we catch you not living in accordance with that, I get upset, right? And I think it happened to a number of people that were young leaders. And so we'd sit that person down to bring correction. And I don't think I always did it now, and whatever reason, but as a father, especially, and as a pastor, I view judgment and punishment really as a means to some kind of end, right? To me, judgment is never the end. It's not. In the prophets, it's not. On the cross, it's not. It's always to bring about restoration of relationship, right? That's the goal. Not just when you have kids, you don't just punish your kids to punish them, because that would be weird and maybe abusive, right? No, you do it because you want to teach them to be a full, functioning, thriving human being. and they've got to learn. They've got to have course correction. But I think when I was a leader, on a number of occasions, I would punish people just to punish them, and that's an abuse of power, misuse of power. And most specifically, we would send students home, and some of them needed to go home because they're like, we're not in a good place to be at a school like this, and that's fair. But what I regret to this day is no follow-up. So we'd send students home, and they'd go home, and maybe it was a good reason, there were some strange things that would go on, but I wouldn't follow back up with them like, hey, how are you doing? Have you gotten, some counseling for that issue? Have you gotten plugged into a community of faith, or just a community of friends that are loving and caring for you? How can we grab lunch? Can we talk about it? And, some of those people, I don't know, I think I probably wounded them. No one's come back to me, but I have no doubt that I probably did. And much like when my kids grow older, I'll have to sort of explain some of the things to them why I did what I did as a young father. But I do regret that. I think that I definitely misused my power and was more concerned about punishing people than I was about, helping people, more gracious, you know what I mean? And so there's that. I think that's one thing that I deeply regret about my time at YWAM, that was on me. And you become sort of this like looking out for people doing wrong things, you know what I mean? And I used to laugh because one of the things that would happen was we'd get these like all staff retreats, and then somebody would get up and like, there's sin in the camp, and we'd all go, oh man, and then you'd wait for someone to confess these sins. And it would look like God had really showed somebody that there was sin in the camp, because as soon as they would say it, dozens of people would walk up front and confess them. And then as I got older, I'm like, wait a minute, there's 150 people in here. Somebody in here has got sin in their life. We're all humans. I mean, like somebody was, had an angry spirit. Somebody was looking at porn over there. Somebody over there had stole something. It's just the odds were pretty good. But it was like, we were so obsessed with finding the sin in the camp. I'm like, there's always, I don't know, we're broken people. Somebody's always sinning somewhere. Like, so just calm down. Let's work on healing. And so as a pastor now, I'm much more interested in that long healing process with people rather than just sort of cutting them off. And I learned that there, I think, too. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but how I would prepare people, I think what you did is awesome. And it's wonderful, because I think you do that no matter what, right? If someone's going to go and play college sports, you got to prepare them. Like, hey, this is not going to all be sunshine and rainbows. It's a grind. It's a slog. Your schoolwork might suffer. How are you going to handle drinking? How are you going to handle partying? And the same with YWAM. Like, hey, here are some of the things that I know to be true. Here's some of the ills. Not everyone's like this, but not everyone is not like this, And so here are the things, the pitfalls, and then I think keep those lines of communication open, and teach them to be a critical thinker. And like you said, be an astute person who can learn, but also be a critical, learner, and to push back a little bit, not to be a jerk, but or to be provocative for provocative sake, but because it's a healthy thing, right, for the system, and also poke and prod before you go there. Like, okay, what is this base all about? What do you stand for? How do you handle this? How do you handle that? And then make sure you kind of fit, and make sure you're kind of going in the same direction. And some things are idiosyncratic, fine. Like the bedtime, I don't know, not abusive necessarily. If I'm a 40-year-old now, and I'm probably not going to go there because I don't want to go to bed at 10 o'clock, whatever. But maybe that's fine for you. Other things are not idiosyncratic. They could be, and you can, like you said, you could spot those. And so if they're coming to you for advice on how to go to this place, that's half the battle, because they have someone like you in their life who can help them bring discernment. I love spiritual direction. I go to a spiritual director myself. And she's totally different than I am. She's a Catholic woman from up in St. John's, St. Ben's rather. And she just will sit with me and let me talk and hear, and she'll try to hear what she thinks God is saying in my life based on what I say. So it's not one direction where she's telling me what God is saying. It's me expressing what I think God is doing, and then it's like a sounding board. And I found it to be very, very helpful. So for people like that in YWAM, to be able to have someone outside the system that can be a sounding board, can hear what God is doing, is very, very helpful. And you certainly could be someone like that was it you said a relative was doing that, or a friend?
My niece.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, niece. Okay, niece. Yeah. So that's all really, really helpful and positive kinds of things. And those are the things I'd say, to be able to have that feedback from someone. So.
what we haven't at all talked about is theology in YWAM.
Yeah.
And so what I've learned from the online community is that people accuse YWAM of either being evangelical, not being evangelical enough, being crazy, mysterious, into occult stuff like Bethel.
Oh, sure.
Synonymous.
Bethel and Reading, not Bethel University, my alma mater.
Oh, sure, yeah. California.
That's right. Yeah.
And then also I've met people who like Peter Helms, universalists, and so not not Christian, what people consider unchristian enough. So
sure, not Orthodox or something.
What exactly? Though in their minds, of course, they are Orthodox too, and of course, that's what I would fall into. I consider myself, not that I made this up or pulled it out of a hat. This is a long Christian tradition.
Oh, right.
That you just don't know if you just came to faith and your tradition started 200 years ago. But that in itself is so much cause for confusion and struggle, and people get kicked out for not having the right faith, whatever that is. Though I would want to say that the people that are inclusive usually don't kick people out for not agreeing with them. So what have you seen there, and how would you advise people to go through that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's actually a question I wrestle with because, well, I would say this, I think the location I was at was actually very helpful for me theologically. So, and again, I don't mean to sound only romantic, but it was. Like the things I was being attracted to, like Greg Boyd and his discussions on open theism and a non-Calvinist way of thinking about the world. So whether it's open theism or Arminianism, but more of an open future, or the opposite of whatever, determinism is. That's where I was leaning towards that. I was leaning away from Calvinism, that 5-point Calvinism, or atonement theories. Like I am not a big fan of the penal substitutionary atonement view of the atonement. So Baxter and I met through Greg actually, and that was all being fostered at YWAM. There was the base assistant director. His name is Barry Howard. Smart dude, one of my good friends. He was in Mensa. He got an MBA later from Johns Hopkins. He and I would sit and just talk about theology, and he was like really helpful. A guy called Al McBryant came through, and he was an open theist, and so I didn't get a lot of that constricting. Now, here's the thing I would say. I had friends who were there who were Calvinists, and they were like, "Why don't we get to hear the Calvinist point of view?" And back then I was like, "Cause it's wrong, man." And then I thought, well, it would be good for discussion. Like I teach theology. I have taught theology at Bethel University in St. Paul, and it's the intro to theology. So it's like all these freshmen, usually freshmen or sophomores, who it's a requirement. So it's all these kids. Most of them don't really want to be a pastor. They have to take the class, and I love that kind of student. And so some of those kids aren't Christians. It's whatever. It's a Christian university, but they're there to play hockey or to get a nursing degree. Point is, when I would teach theology, and I got my cues from Victor Zigbo, he was my professor at seminary, Nigerian theologian, brilliant. He would say, here's like the 7 ways to think about God's determinism in the world. And here they all are. Let's talk about all of them, and let's talk about the pros and cons or the holes in all of them. Because, believe it or not, and you probably know this, every theory, every theology, every way of thinking about the world, it has elements of it that you have to address, because like, what about this? And it's like, yeah, none of these are like foolproof, you know what I mean? Yeah. And so I would love doing that. Like, I'm not here to indoctrinate you, especially in university. Like, let's all think, I want to teach you all the ways historically that Christians have thought about these things and let you wrestle with it. Because I think more in line with the rabbinical tradition and the Jewish story, like the beauty was in the dance, right? The midrash. It was in the wrestling, the tension, the arguing. These rabbis all had varying theologies or views on the Torah. They would argue about it, and that was half of the, well, if not all of the fun. Like that was the meat of it. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, Israel is one who wrestles with God, and they wrestled with God. And so, anyway, I've always tried to promote that. Even here, I get a little bit nervous about my own self, right? Because I'm the pastor here, and in many ways, I do feel a sense of like I'm the one to set the theological direction. Now, it feels strange because that's a lot of weight to carry, right? But I don't do it alone. I do it in concert with the staff, with the council, with my own spiritual director, with people I know and trust. But they've asked me to do that. Like the people of Central say, we want you to be the pastor, you to teach us, give us theological instruction. So I always tell them this is how I see it. But I've always thought the sermon is a lot of like, let's walk into this room together and explore and look around, and Abraham Joshua Heschel said that I didn't ask for success, I asked for wonder. So my job as the pastor is to help people explore on their own theological, ideas and implications in the Bible story and fall in love with the whole thing and whatever. Now, that being said, doing that, there might be folks who land at a different place than where I am as the pastor. And it's happened already, right? And they will go somewhere else. And I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what to make of all that because, and you were mentioning earlier about another person you've interviewed, same kind of thing as a pastor he experienced where people will go somewhere else. Sometimes I don't think it's bad. Like they're going a different direction. They're going to talk about different things than we're talking about. So they will go to, now there's a million churches to pick from. So in some ways it's like, oh, okay. My wife and I were chatting earlier about how strange it is that people will just up and leave a church. But also I get it, like they're going a different direction than where we're going. And that's fair. I don't love this idea of a consumer driven church experience. Like I'll just go wherever they tickle my ears. Fine. But also you want to go the same direction. So that being said, YWAM is no different in that a lot of the locations have different leanings. I remember back in the day, the Montana base, I think it's in beautiful one up by the lake. I forget what it's called, but they were more of a Calvinist location. So when they taught their Bible school, it had very strong Calvinist leanings. And so I remember thinking as a young man, oh, I'm not going there, right? Because I didn't want to go there. And so I think it's, I don't know what to make of all that other than I think when you're going to go, if you're going to go to a school there and do a DTS or whatever, it's important to like explore, hey, it's like you would with a church, like, hey, I'm going to go to this church. What's your aim? How do you read those scriptures? You and I have talked about what is the good news to you? What does it mean? What does the gospel mean to you? And then to kind of not be afraid of dissenting views, but hey, you're going to kind of be in mission with those people because you're kind of going the same direction. And YWAM is just no different because again, they all have that freedom to kind of choose how they read the scripture and how they interpret it, kind of thing. So I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So you're basically saying to kind of do a little reconnaissance beforehand if you have a certain preference, but also again hold that loosely and maybe go somewhere where you're outside of your comfort zone, knowing though that those people, you will be surrounded by people who will say certain things in the missionary work, I assume, and then you kind of might be shrugging and wondering, no, this is not good news at all what we're telling these people right now. Which would,
and I think too.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I didn't qualify those terms. So like when people are like, oh, they're not evangelical enough, I'm always like, what do you mean by evangelical? And I don't want to be pedantic, but like people mean all kinds of things by that word. Like I'm an evangelical, and because Luther wasn't evangelical, the evangelism, the euangelion is this announcement of good news. So, I mean, we're all evangelicals, hopefully. Now, evangelicalism has been co-opted in many ways currently, but so I'm always like, what do you mean by that? I mean, because evangelicals generally love the word of God. Great, I do too. Evangelicals like the good news. Great, Jesus. Great. But again, sometimes it means other things for people though. So ask them, or what do you mean by, again, good news? What is the good news to you? What Jesus died for your sins? What does that mean to you? And help them qualify for you what they mean. Help them unpack those words. I was asked recently, if I'm progressive, and I was like, well, and I'm like, I don't want to be a butthead, forgive my term there, but I'm like, what do you mean by that? Like, because progressive means, and it was because we've been preaching here we preach about the Magi during Epiphany and how the gospel opens up it right from the jump to the Gentiles. And it's this radically inclusive gospel, like even the Magi, these Eastern Zoroastrian philosophy, weirdos from the East are included in the Jesus story. Like, how bizarre is that? I love it.
Yep.
And then we talked about women and how women have, are included in the gospel. And it's like, it seems kind of funny that it's 2021 with it acknowledge that. But, and the Bible, of course it has all these male androcentric themes, but the Bible is also extremely progressive in the way it elevates women. You know, in Genesis 1, male and female were created in the image of God. This God, Yahweh, we learn later, this God has maleness and femaleness, this God. Rarely in cosmological, you know, in cosmologies was there ever a female outside of the God, right, or God. But in this Jewish story,
and the spirit being female, and
absolutely, the ruach, yeah, and so like, that's extremely progressive. And so, but I said, but if you think I mean some sort of political ideology, then no, I'm not interested in that. I just don't care about that. But the ideas of the Bible are progressive in that they challenged. By progress, I just mean like they were progressing, they were moving forward, you know. Mosaic law said eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. Jesus said, no, we're going to change that, make it even more gracious and humble. But Mosaic law was actually progressive compared to what the ancients would do to each other, you know, when they were wronged. And so anyway, I always want to qualify terms and not to be rude, but like, what do you mean by that? How do you think about that? And that's always helpful as well.
Yeah, all very interesting. Now I'm gonna say something that has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but it has something to do with what you just said, as if we were just talking. You said, you know, you don't care about political stuff, and I don't want to talk politics. I want to quote from Postcards from Babylon, from the documentary. They have a activist theologian named Lisa Sharon Harper on.
Okay.
And she pushes back. She's a Black woman, and she says, wait. If you say you don't care about politics and progressive, you're essentially saying you don't care that things change for the people that are oppressed. And that is an important thing, I think, to consider, because that's, again, that's my angle too. I'm talking about the oppressed, right? And so that's where the tricky part is. A system needs to ask itself again and again, am I benefiting from oppressing people or other oppressed people around me? And then, of course, as we go maybe full circle, what you would consider a blessing, being told when to go to bed, someone else would consider oppressive. But the people, I would want to imagine that the people that walked away from their YWAM experience extremely hurt, saying it's a cult, it's very abusive, shock people with what they have been through. They would probably not mention stories like that. But then again, in that sense, you have not seen any of that, which doesn't mean that it didn't happen. So
exactly. I would just say one other thing too, like, no doubt that I think if I, you know, your listeners that are there that have been abused by YWAM or other places, institutions, people, you know, by all means, I think what you're doing for them, Christina, is helpful, that you're helping provide, giving them a voice, because I think that in many, again, not in every, but in many times, I'll say this, we don't do the best job, I think, in our culture of listening to those who've been abused. I have friends who've been abused, my sister, and so on. And it's hard. The abused often doesn't have the power. And so they often get neglected, ignored. And that's a shame. It really is, you know. And so I think that one of the things we can do to help is to help give voice to those who've been abused. And then going back to the political, so what I mean is that political ideology. So ideologies to me become a life in themselves. So I'm not interested in those ideological viewpoints where we sort of entrench ourselves in this way of thinking about, you know, and it has a life of its own. But politics, I'm sure interested in. So Lauren Winter, who taught my class in my year one of my doctorate program, she's an instructor at Duke. She's awesome. She said that politics can simply be defined as how power is arranged. And I'm like, oh, that's so good. So everything has a politic. This Zoom call has a politic. You know, you're the host, so you have more power than I do. Although I talk loud and I talk longer, so maybe whatever, you know. But like, churches have a politic. Prayer has a politic. She wrote a really good book about and your listeners should check it out if you're interested. It's I don't know what the title is. It's here somewhere, but it's about the abuses. I don't think she uses that word though, but of spiritual practice, how spiritual practices can actually be destructive in some ways. It's really a fascinating read. But anyway, I'm for sure interested in that. How is power arranged, and who's benefiting from that structure, if there is one, and who's not benefiting from it? And I always go back to the Pharaoh, how the Pharaoh's Egypt, it was a hierarchy, and he was at the top. And I'm not one who thinks that hierarchies in and of themselves are bad. I think they're just whatever. But hierarchies become a problem when there's no movement, when there's no fluidity, right? So in Pharaoh's Egypt, the Pharaoh's at the top. He's always there. He never will leave there. And who's at the bottom? Well, the slaves, the Jewish slaves. And there's no fluidity, That's a problem. And so that politic is evil, abusive, oppressive. And the people of God should be people who speak out against those systems of oppression, no doubt, and try to do work to dismantle those and free. The Bible's about liberation, right? So that I'm definitely, and she's right. I don't recall her name, but she's right that we've got to be able to be people who help bring liberation wherever we find oppression.
Yep, Lisa Sharon Harper. And what was the name of the professor you mentioned? Lauren
Winner. W-I, and I'm gonna look up her book real quick, but Lauren, and then Winner is Winner, and she teaches at Duke University, and she is unbelievably brilliant. Her newest book is called The Dangers of Christian Practice. It's very, very good. But so I did my year one of my doctoral studies was on a history and theology of Christian spirituality, and she was the instructor, and so we read a lot of books that were like really great about, ancient spiritual practices and prayer, meditation. Then she wrote a book about the dangers of some of these. And a lot of it's about politics, how is power arranged? And she gives an example, for example, of a slave owner in the days of American slavery. She would pray in her prayer journal. She would pray for her slaves. It's like, what? And so she explores these ways in which our spiritual practices can actually be, they can be dangerous, because we're humans. And so it's a good book. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Now it's so early in the year and I already have like 5 books that I need to order. But I do need to order that one for sure.
Oh, and she's so smart. One of the smartest people I've ever met. And again, I only got to know her through this class and it was just a couple of sessions, but she's brilliant woman. So
wonderful. Yeah. Well, I think we need to wrap it up, but
yes,
that was interesting. I'm glad that you're not doing either, or you're trying to do both, and that I think is part of pursuing help for my listeners. If we stay in the place of the hurt, when we don't ask, what can I learn from this, how can this propel forward, we will stay in the place of trauma. And of course that's real too, that we can't pull ourselves up by the bootstraps. That's where asking for help comes in, and
most definitely
people, resources that are helpful to you. So thank you so much, Ryan.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Christina. I really appreciate it. And again, I hope it was helpful. And again, keep up with the good work. I love what you do, and I think it's great. So
thank you.